Imagine the Earth in a time when silence stretched across entire continents. The year is not measured, the day not recorded, for calendars do not yet exist. What matters is the cold, the endless, pressing cold. The horizon gleams white, not with fleeting snow, but with ice that has become the very shape of the land. Walls of frozen mass rise hundreds of meters, as immovable as mountains, yet alive with their own slow rhythm. If you stand close, you can hear them breathe, groans and cracks deep within, as if the earth itself is sighing beneath their weight. This is the world at the height of the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago, though the story of ice stretches far deeper into time. Nearly a third of Earth's land is buried beneath glaciers. North America lies under the Laurentide ice sheet, a frozen shield so vast it extends from the Atlantic coast deep into the plains. Across the ocean, the Fennoscandian ice sheet grips northern Europe, swallowing valleys and rivers alike. In these places, the land is buried beneath kilometers of compacted snow, pressed into crystal by the weight of centuries. The sun is weak here, hanging low in the sky. Its light feels distant, scattered by an atmosphere dry and clear. Shadows stretch endlessly across the plains, broken only by the shimmering face of the ice. Where the glaciers end, the world opens into windswept grasslands, the Mammoth Steppe. It is a place of extremes, summers short and cool, winters brutal and long. The soil is frozen beneath the surface, yet tough grasses and herbs cling stubbornly to life. And where plants survive, animals follow. Step quietly into this scene and you see them. A line of woolly mammoths trudges forward in the snow, great bodies swaying with the rhythm of migration. Their fur hangs in shaggy mats, layered for insulation, while beneath their skin a thick pad of fat guards against the bitter wind. Their tusks curve like crescents, sweeping low and then curling upward, tools as much as weapons. With them walk their calves, smaller shadows pressed tight to their mothers, trusting the herd's strength to carry them through the storm. Farther across the plain, a herd of bison crowds together. Their breath rises in clouds, drifting into the icy air. Musk oxen form circles, horns outward, protecting their young. Every movement here is shaped by survival, every choice by the cold, and yet this world is not empty of danger. At the edge of vision, predators wait. A cave lion crouches low, its golden coat pale against the grass. Its eyes track the herd with patience, every muscle held in silence. Not far away, a saber-toothed cat stalks through the brittle weeds, its canines glinting like polished ivory. These hunters are built for power, not speed. They rely on ambush, on a sudden burst of strength, to bring down prey that dwarfs them in size. Life in this frozen dawn is harsh, but it is abundant, and above all, it is balanced. Herds feed on the steppe grasses, predators follow the herds, scavengers follow the predators. Nothing here is wasted. The Ice Age is not merely an age of death, it is an age of adaptation, a theater of resilience played out under skies both bleak and beautiful. But there is another figure in this landscape, one less imposing in size but remarkable in endurance: the human. Across these plains, scattered bands of people move with the seasons, following the migrations that sustain them. Wrapped in furs stitched from sinew, their footprints press into snow that will vanish with the next storm. They carry spears tipped with stone, tools shaped with precision and care. At night, they gather around fires, the only warmth against the howling dark. Flames crackle, sparks spiral upward, and shadows dance across the walls of caves or shelters made of bone and hide. Inside those caves, another kind of story unfolds. The walls come alive with paintings, mammoths, bison, horses, hands outlined in ochre. These images are not idle sketches, they are memory, shared across generations, reminders of hunts, spirits, or simply the presence of life in a world ruled by cold. No one can say for certain why they painted, perhaps to teach, perhaps to honor, perhaps to make sense of the vastness pressing in around them. Whatever the reason, their art still speaks across the millennia, whispering that even in this frozen dawn, people found ways not only to survive, but to create. The glaciers themselves loom beyond the plains, silent monuments of ice. They seem eternal, yet they are always in motion. Inch by inch they advance, grinding mountains into jagged ridges and valleys into sweeping curves. Stones the size of houses are carried across the land, deposited hundreds of kilometers from where they were formed. As they retreat, they leave behind lakes, ridges, and fields of boulders. Even now, in the landscapes of Scandinavia, Canada, and the northern United States, you can trace the path of these frozen giants. The earth we walk today is carved by their passage. Night falls on this world with a silence that is both profound and unsettling. Without cities or lights, the stars blaze brighter than most of us will ever see. The Milky Way stretches overhead in a river of pale fire. In the far north, auroras ripple across the sky, bands of green and violet flickering like spirits above the ice. For those who lived then, such sights were not explained by physics, but by story. They looked to the heavens and saw meaning, perhaps ancestors, perhaps gods. Below those skies, people huddled closer to their fires. The wind pressed against the cave entrance, wolves howled in the distance, and the cold crept in wherever the firelight faded. Yet in the glow, voices rose. Stories were told of hunts and journeys, of animals and spirits, of what lay beyond the ice. For them, this was not prehistory. It was life, carried on breath and memory, as real and immediate as the frozen ground beneath their feet. The Ice Age was not uniform, not a single endless freeze. Even in this dawn, the cold ebbed and flowed. Summers loosened the grip of ice, allowing grasses to flourish and rivers to swell. Winters returned with ferocity, snow piling in layers that never melted. These cycles, driven by shifts in Earth's orbit and tilt, would in time shape the rhythm of the entire age. But for those who lived it, the change was almost invisible. A child born into frost would grow old and die, never knowing the land could ever be different. The frozen dawn felt eternal, even as the planet was already moving toward its next transformation. The frozen dawn was not only written in snow and silence, it was also etched into the very shape of the land. Wherever glaciers pressed, the earth yielded. Mountains were sharpened into jagged ridges. Valleys gouged into broad sweeping U-shapes. Rivers were rerouted, their courses bent or blocked by walls of advancing ice. When the glaciers melted, they left behind vast networks of lakes, scattered like mirrors across the northern hemisphere. Even today, the fingerprints of their power are plain to see. The Great Lakes in North America, the deep fjords of Norway, the countless tarns scattered across Scotland. Each is a reminder that ice is not passive. It is sculptor, architect, destroyer, and creator all at once. As the glaciers expanded, the seas receded. The water that once filled the oceans became locked in frozen vaults of ice. Coastlines stretched outward, exposing vast new lands. One of these was Beringia, a broad, treeless plain that joined Asia to North America. It was not merely a bridge of rock and earth. It was an entire ecosystem, tundra rich with grass, moss, and sedge, swept by herds of mammoth and caribou. Wolves and cave lions stalked them, and behind the predators came people. Step by step, they crossed into a new continent, not as conquerors, but as wanderers, following the rhythm of survival. Their journey would reshape the story of humanity, though they could not have known it at the time. South of the glaciers, the world looked different. The Ice Age was not uniform frost from pole to pole. Nearer the equator, forests still flourished. Rivers wound through green valleys. Deserts spread wider than before, for the atmosphere was drier, rainfall more scarce. Life shifted in response. Where grasslands opened, great herds thrived. Where forests shrank, animals retreated into shrinking refuges, clinging to patches of warmth in a cooling world. The Mammoth Steppe, stretching across Eurasia and North America, was one of the richest ecosystems the Earth has ever known. It spanned more than 13 million square kilometers, larger than the Amazon rainforest today. Covered in hardy grasses and wildflowers, it supported an astonishing density of life. Tens of millions of animals roamed its plains. Mammoths, bison, horses, muskoxen, each one grazing, moving, and in turn feeding predators. This was no frozen desert. It was an empire of grass, a place of abundance wrapped in cold. And humans walked through it all. They were not many, but they were resourceful. Their tools grew more sophisticated with each generation. Blades chipped from flint, spears balanced for the throw, needles carved from bone to stitch hides against the wind. In their fires and their art lay something no other creature had mastered, the ability to imagine beyond the present. They painted not only what they saw, but what they believed. They carved figurines of animals and of mothers, symbols of life and fertility in a world where both were precarious. These acts were more than survival. They were a claim against the silence of the ice, proof that humanity could make meaning even in the harshest dawn. The frozen world left marks not only on landscapes and animals, but on people themselves. Bodies adapted over generations. Some populations developed stockier builds, conserving heat. Others mastered the use of fire, shelters, and clothing so thoroughly that they could survive even in places where no other primate had ever ventured. These adaptations were not chosen consciously. They were carved into humans by the same forces that shaped the valleys and fjords, slow, relentless, unavoidable. Yet for all its might, the frozen dawn was never still. Even as glaciers locked continents in their grip, the Earth moved through cycles of cold and warmth. Driven by subtle changes in its orbit and tilt, the planet breathed. Winters deepened into millennia of frost, then slowly softened. Summers grew longer, grasses spread, rivers swelled, forests returned. The glaciers retreated, only to advance again, in rhythms so vast that no single lifetime could comprehend them. To those who lived then, nothing seemed to change. A child born in the shadow of the ice would die in the same world. Yet over thousands of years, the ice crept forward, then slipped back, like a tide across continents. The frozen dawn was both a beginning and a threshold. It gave rise to ecosystems that would vanish with the thaw. It tested humanity in ways that would forge new skills, new migrations, and new myths. And it left behind landscapes that still bear its mark. The scoured valleys of the Rockies, the boulders abandoned on European plains, the frozen cores of Greenland and Antarctica where ancient air still sleeps, waiting to tell its story. Stand once more on that ancient plain. The sky is streaked with pale light. A herd of mammoths moves steadily, their shadows long against the snow. Behind them, a group of humans follows, small, fragile figures against the immensity of the ice. Their breath curls into the air, their steps crunch into the frozen earth. They do not know they are part of an age. They do not know the glaciers will one day vanish. They know only that they must keep moving, one step after another, into the wind, into the unknown. The frozen dawn was not an end. It was a beginning, vast and cold and alive with promise. And already, hidden within its cycles of cold and warmth, the next chapter of the Earth was waiting to unfold. The Ice Age was never a single, unbroken freeze. It was a rhythm, a pulse that shifted the face of the Earth again and again. To imagine it as endless winter is to miss the truth, that the planet moved between extremes, swinging slowly from deep cold into warmth, then back again. Each swing lasted tens of thousands of years, long enough that no single generation could see the change in full, yet powerful enough to redraw entire continents. The heart of these cycles lay not in chance, but in the mechanics of the Earth itself. Our planet tilts slightly on its axis, wobbles in its spin, and follows an orbit that stretches and compresses as millennia pass. These movements, subtle in themselves, alter how much sunlight falls upon the northern and southern latitudes. A fraction less warmth, sustained over centuries, allows snow to linger through summer. Layer upon layer, the snow compacts into ice, and the glaciers march outward. A fraction more warmth, and the ice thins, retreats, and rivers and forests return. This celestial clock, invisible to those who lived beneath it, dictated the destiny of land, sea, and life alike. When the glaciers advanced, their power was immense. Oceans shrank as water was locked in frozen sheets. Shorelines stretched outward, exposing lands that today lie beneath waves. In these colder intervals, deserts expanded, rainfall diminished, and grasslands spread across the middle latitudes. The world grew sharper, harsher, drier. For those who lived then, survival narrowed to bands of land where animals still flowed and rivers still flowed. And yet, in the interludes of warmth, the interglacials, the world softened. Ice retreated northward, valleys bloomed with forests, and rains returned to the tropics. Deserts shrank, lakes filled, and the land once more became generous. Species that had been pushed into refuge spread outward again. Humans followed, exploring new corridors, crossing bridges of land revealed by lower seas, chasing herds into territories newly freed from frost. To step into one of these warmer intervals is to witness a world reborn. Imagine the plains of Europe, once scoured by ice, now green with birch and oak. Red deer move cautiously among the trees. Wild horses graze in open clearings, and aurochs, massive wild cattle, push their way through underbrush. Rivers once clogged with meltwater now run full but gentle, carrying fish in their currents. Birds fill the air with sound. For the first time in millennia, the land breathes freely again. But the warmth was never permanent. Slowly, imperceptibly, the orbit shifted, the tilt changed, and the ice returned. Summers shortened, winters deepened, and snow once again lingered long enough to harden into glaciers. Forests withered, giving way to open plains. Herds that had grazed beneath green canopies now wandered across steppe once more, pursued by predators built for cold. And people moved too. They abandoned valleys that froze, sought new refuges, and passed on to their children the knowledge of where warmth could still be found. Each cycle left marks that endured beyond its time. In the lowest plains of China, wind-blown dust settled thickly during the coldest stretches, layer upon layer of pale earth that can still be read today like the pages of a book. In Africa, lakes swelled and shrank with the rains, leaving behind beaches now stranded high above the desert floor. In Europe, alternating bands of forest pollen and grass pollen, trapped in ancient soil, tell of the land's constant transformation. The record is everywhere, if one knows where to look. For animals, these shifts demanded resilience. Mammoths thrived when the grasslands spread, their molars perfectly suited to grind tough, dry vegetation. When forests returned, their ranges contracted, leaving them vulnerable. Saber-toothed cats followed herds across open plains, but as trees grew dense, their advantage in ambush weakened, and other predators rose in their place. Some creatures adapted, changing form and behavior to survive each turn of the cycle. Others disappeared entirely. Their time ended not in sudden catastrophe, but in the slow tightening of the planet's rhythm. Humans too were tested. During the coldest glacial peaks, Europe was nearly empty of people. The ice stretched too far, the land was too barren. Communities retreated south into warmer enclaves, what scientists call refugia. In these havens, small populations endured, often isolated for centuries. With the return of warmth, they spread northward again, repopulating lands once abandoned. These expansions and contractions shaped language, culture, and even genetic heritage as isolated groups mingled once more when the world opened. The cycles gave as much as they took. Land bridges appeared when seas were low, allowing migrations that would have been impossible otherwise. Asia and North America were joined across the Bering Land Bridge, a frozen corridor wide enough for entire herds to pass. Humans followed, step by step, into a new continent. Across what is now Southeast Asia, islands were connected by dry land, binding territories that today are separated by ocean. Each glacial maximum rewrote the map of the Earth, and each interglacial restored the seas. Imagine the perspective of a family living through such changes. A grandparent recalls hunting on plains that are now covered by forest. A child is born into warmth, but by the time they are old, winters last longer, summers shorter, and the herds migrate differently. No one speaks of glaciers advancing or retreating. They simply live the change, as subtle as the shifting of wind or the passing of generations. The ice breathes, and they breathe within it. As the planet shifted between extremes, every cycle carried its own signature. Some glaciations pressed farther, swallowing valleys and mountain ranges that had survived earlier advances. Others fell short, retreating before they reached the same limits. The record of these pulses lies not just in ice cores and sediments, but in the scars written across the continents themselves. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet advanced southward, burying half a continent in ice. When it withdrew, it released floods of unimaginable scale. Entire lakes, trapped at the edge of the ice, burst free when their walls collapsed, unleashing torrents that scoured the land and carved new channels. The course of the Mississippi River was reshaped by such floods, its wide valley an echo of meltwater that once thundered toward the Gulf. In the Pacific Northwest, cataclysmic surges drained Lake Missoula again and again, gouging deep coulees and leaving behind fields of giant boulders. These floods were not singular events, but repeating notes in the song of retreating glaciers. In Europe, the story was different, but no less dramatic. As the ice pushed south, it carved across Scandinavia and into northern Germany and Poland, grinding the land into plains and ridges. When it retreated, it left behind thousands of lakes scattered across Finland, a country whose name still evokes its watery inheritance. Farther south, rivers like the Danube and Rhine shifted courses again and again, their paths redirected by advancing walls of ice or swelling with meltwater as the glaciers pulled back. Asia bore its own rhythms. The great lowest deposits of northern China, fine dust carried by winds during glacial maxima, thicken layer by layer over hundreds of thousands of years. Each band of loess speaks of cold, dry winds sweeping across exposed steppe. Between them lie thinner, darker layers of soil, formed in warmer times when plants bound the ground and rain softened the land. It is here, in these silent layers, that the pulse of glacial and interglacial is captured most clearly, a visible rhythm marked in earth. For the people who lived through these shifts, the changes were subtle, stretched across generations, yet they dictated every choice. During colder centuries, herds shifted south, and humans followed, pressing into refuges where game could still be found. These pockets became lifelines, the caves of Iberia, the river valleys of Italy, the Black Sea coasts. In such places, populations survived in relative isolation, sometimes for thousands of years. When warmth returned, they spread again, recolonizing lands that had lain empty. With each expansion, ideas and tools traveled too, carried in the hands of hunters and families who moved along rivers, across valleys, and eventually into entirely new continents. The environment did not simply shape where people could live, but also what they believed. Imagine a small group gathered at the mouth of a cave during a warming interval. They have returned to a valley their ancestors abandoned generations before. Trees are pushing through the soil, the river runs deeper, animals return in numbers unseen in living memory. To the children, this is a new world. To the elders, it is a rebirth. Such cycles, though not understood in scientific terms, must have seeded stories of destruction and renewal, of lands given and taken back, of ancestors who once walked here and returned again. In Africa, the same rhythms shifted the pulse of rain. When glaciers expanded in the north, monsoon systems weakened, and the Sahara grew wider, cutting across the continent like a barrier of sand. Populations dwindled, waterholes dried, and life contracted into scattered oases. Then, with warmth, the rains returned, the Sahara bloomed with grass, and rivers cut through the desert once more. Rock paintings still found on ancient cliffs show giraffes, elephants, even hippos wandering where today only dunes remain. These images are not fantasy, they are memory, painted by people who lived in a greener Sahara during one of the warm intervals. Everywhere the pattern was the same: contraction and expansion, loss and renewal, and with each shift, life adapted or disappeared. Some animals proved remarkably resilient. Reindeer tracked the ice edge faithfully, thriving in both steppe and tundra. Wolves adapted their diet and range, surviving where saber-toothed cats could not. Humans, though vulnerable in body, possessed the single greatest adaptation of all: the ability to plan, to imagine, to prepare for a world not yet here. It was this gift that allowed them not only to endure the cycles but to expand within them, turning each change into an opening. The cycles did not just alter where people could live, but how they lived. In colder periods, shelters became crucial: caves, mammoth bone huts, fires carefully tended through the night. Clothing stitched from hide and fur grew more elaborate, tailored with bone needles to fit closely against the skin. In warmer interludes, resources multiplied, and humans had time for more than survival. They painted, carved, and experimented with new tools. The rhythm of ice and warmth became the rhythm of human innovation, constraining in one age, inspiring in the next. Though imperceptible day by day, the cycles accumulated into vast legacies. Each retreating glacier left behind valleys scoured clean, lakes formed in its wake, soils rich with new sediment. Each warming brought forests that anchored themselves in those valleys, covering scars with green. Each cooling stripped them away again. The land was never static, never fixed. It shifted as the earth shifted, breathing in cold, exhaling warmth. And in that endless motion lay the stage for what would follow. The glaciers were not finished reshaping the world. Each pulse of advance and retreat carved deeper into the earth, preparing the ground for rivers, plains, and mountains that still define the continents today. The cycles of cold and warmth were not only rhythms of climate, they were the architects of the landscapes that future generations would inherit. Glaciers are not passive blankets of frozen water. They are rivers of ice, immense and unrelenting, flowing with a force that shapes entire continents. At first glance, they seem still, frozen in silence, but beneath the surface, they are always in motion, pushed forward by the weight of snow pressing down year after year. Over centuries, the pressure turns snow into ice so dense it behaves like liquid stone, creeping downhill and spreading outward. Slowly, almost invisibly, glaciers move, meters each year, sometimes more. Over millennia, that motion becomes power enough to carve mountains, redirect rivers, and sculpt valleys that remain long after the ice has vanished. Picture the high peaks of what we now call the Alps or the Rockies. Long before tourists admired their ridges, glaciers were grinding them into their present form. Jagged peaks, sharp as teeth, were once higher and steeper. The ice wrapped around them, chipping and fracturing rock, plucking entire boulders from the mountainside and dragging them downhill. Valleys between the peaks, once narrow and V-shaped from river erosion, were deepened and widened by the grinding mass of ice until they became the broad U-shaped valleys we know today. Step into one of these valleys now, in Switzerland, in Norway, in Montana, and you are walking through a monument left by glaciers. The steep walls, the flat floors, the hanging side valleys that end abruptly in cliffs, all are signatures of ice. Waterfalls that tumble into these valleys are not just beautiful scenery. They are reminders that the land once carried ice thousands of meters thick, sculpting rock as if it were clay. The shaping power of glaciers extended far beyond the mountains. As they advanced, they ground bedrock into fine particles, creating a powder called glacial flour. This dust, carried by wind for hundreds of kilometers, settled in thick blankets of soil that would one day become farmland. Some of the richest agricultural regions in the world owe their fertility to this process. The black earth of Ukraine, the vast Loess plains of northern China, and the breadbasket of the American Midwest all rest on the legacy of glaciers grinding stone into soil. Glaciers carried not only dust, but entire boulders. Rocks the size of houses were pried loose and transported across the landscape, deposited miles away from their origins when the ice melted. Today, they sit alone in fields or forests, strange and out of place, known as erratics. To early people, these solitary stones must have seemed mysterious, even supernatural. How else could such massive rocks have traveled across flat land, far from any mountain? Only with the rise of modern science did we come to understand them as the fingerprints of moving ice. The retreat of glaciers was as transformative as their advance. When ice sheets melted, they released unimaginable volumes of water. Meltwater pooled against the edges of the ice, forming vast lakes larger than any we know today. In North America, Lake Agassiz stretched across what is now Canada and the northern United States, covering an area larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined. When its ice dams broke, torrents of water surged southward, reshaping the Mississippi Basin and even altering global climate as floods poured into the oceans. Other lakes, smaller but no less striking, were left behind in carved depressions. In Finland alone, there are nearly 200,000 lakes, most of them formed by retreating ice. Scandinavia's fjords, deep and narrow inlets where mountains meet the sea, are glacial valleys drowned by rising oceans. Canada's Hudson Bay is the remnant of an ice sheet so massive that, even today, the land is still slowly rebounding upward from its weight, a process that continues millennia after the ice disappeared. The fingerprints of glaciers are scattered everywhere, waiting to be noticed. A ridge of debris across a countryside. This is a moraine, a pile of rock and soil bulldozed forward by ice and abandoned when it melted. A winding raised line across a plain. This is an esker, formed by rivers that once flowed inside glaciers, leaving behind channels of sand and gravel. Circular hollows filled with water. These are kettle lakes, born when stranded chunks of ice melted into the ground. The variety is endless, but the story is the same. Ice is the great sculptor, reshaping land in ways that last long beyond its age. For the people who lived during the Ice Age, these transformations were not abstract. They saw valleys shift, rivers redirected, and new lakes appearing where none had been before. Imagine a hunter returning to a familiar valley, only to find a river now blocked by a wall of ice, or a meadow drowned by meltwater. To them, the land itself was alive, unpredictable, sometimes generous, sometimes hostile. Myths of moving mountains, of floods and great spirits carving the earth, may well be echoes of these real experiences, passed down in story and ritual. Glaciers also reshaped the climate around them. Their sheer size altered wind patterns and weather systems. As ice sheets spread, they created colder, drier conditions in their shadow, expanding deserts in Africa and Asia. When they retreated, the release of meltwater into oceans disrupted currents, changing rainfall across the globe. The pulse of ice did not stop at the edge of the glacier. It rippled outward, touching every part of the planet. Even the ground beneath the ice was transformed. The weight of the Laurentide and Fennoscandian ice sheets was so great that it pressed the Earth's crust downward, depressing entire regions by hundreds of meters. When the ice melted, the land began to rise again, a slow rebound that continues to this day. In some places, ancient shorelines now lie stranded, far above the current sea, a reminder that the land itself is still adjusting to the absence of its icy burden. Everywhere we look, the land carries the imprint of glaciers. Whether in the jagged peaks of the Alps, the rolling hills of England molded by ice, or the endless prairies of North America nourished by glacial soils, the legacy is undeniable. The Ice Age was not only an age of cold, it was an age of creation, a time when the planet was sculpted into the form we know now. Glaciers were not uniform in their work. Each ice sheet carried its own personality, sculpting the land according to its scale, its speed, and the terrain beneath it. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet sprawled across millions of square kilometers, its edge grinding across plains and carving great basins. It hollowed out depressions that would later fill with water to become the Great Lakes, reshaping the entire heart of a continent. In contrast, the mountain glaciers of the Andes and Himalayas were narrower, but no less dramatic, carving valleys that still channel rivers and human settlements today. The Alps, once thick with ice, were carved into the dramatic forms admired by climbers and travelers, their jagged ridges sharpened by centuries of glacial erosion. The shaping power of ice was not a single stroke, but a layering of countless years, as each season added snow and each century pushed the ice farther, deeper, stronger. The evidence lies in the textures of the land, striations etched into bedrock where stones embedded in glaciers scraped across the surface, parallel lines pointing in the direction the ice once moved. These scratches, sometimes running for hundreds of meters, are quiet signatures of a force vast enough to carry mountains with it. To walk across these grooves today is to place your feet where ice once dragged its burden forward, unstoppable and patient. In landscapes that were ground flat, the aftermath of glaciers is equally striking. The American Midwest, much of Canada, and northern Germany were left as vast rolling plains, fertile soil, enriched with the dust of pulverized rock spread across them, creating some of the world's greatest farmlands. What appears now as endless fields of corn or wheat is the direct gift of glaciers grinding stone into powder. In other regions, the retreat of ice left chaos behind, landscapes littered with erratics, lakes scattered like shattered mirrors, hills and ridges piled from debris once trapped within ice. To those who first explored these post-glacial worlds, the land must have felt both alien and abundant, scarred and fertile at once. Lakes, in particular, became a hallmark of the glacial retreat. The Great Lakes, formed at the edge of the Laurentide, are among the largest bodies of fresh water on Earth. They did not exist before the ice, but were born from its departure. Scandinavia, with its countless lakes and rivers, is another inheritance of glaciers. Canada alone holds nearly half of the planet's lakes, many of them cradled in depressions carved by ice sheets. Each one is a remnant, a memory of frozen giants that once covered the land. Some of the most dramatic landscapes formed by glaciers are the fjords. In Norway, in New Zealand, in Chile, deep valleys carved below sea level by glacial force were later drowned as the seas rose. The result is coastlines where mountains plunge into the ocean, their walls sheer and immense. To sail into a fjord is to enter a cathedral built by ice, its walls silent but eloquent in their testimony of what the world once endured. Glacial legacies extend even to the shape of the ground beneath our feet. The weight of ice depressed the Earth's crust, pushing it downward. When the ice melted, the land began to rebound, rising slowly in a process still underway. In parts of Canada and Scandinavia, the ground continues to lift by centimeters each year. Ancient shorelines now lie stranded above the water, silent witnesses to a world still adjusting to the absence of its icy burden. This slow rebound shows how even after glaciers retreat, their influence lingers for millennia. To understand the shape of ice is to see how it redefined water itself. Meltwater not only filled valleys and lakes, but created immense floods when natural dams failed. The Missoula floods in the Pacific Northwest unleashed walls of water that scoured entire landscapes, carving canyons and leaving behind giant ripple marks visible from the air. These were cataclysms on a scale no human had ever seen before, floods so vast they reshaped regions in a matter of days. The marks remain etched into the land, stark reminders of the violence hidden within glacial retreat. Beyond the land, glaciers also reshaped ecosystems. As ice sheets scraped away soil and forests, they reset the ecological clock. When the ice melted, new communities of plants and animals colonized the bare ground. First came lichens and mosses, hardy pioneers able to cling to raw rock. Then grasses, shrubs, and finally forests, each wave building upon the last. The land we know today as fertile fields, thick woods, or grassy plains was reborn from landscapes scraped clean by ice. Every cycle of advance and retreat was not only destruction, but also creation, erasing the old to make way for the new. For those who lived in these shifting worlds, the transformations were monumental. Imagine standing in a valley where your ancestors once hunted, only to find a new lake barring the path. Or traveling across plains that suddenly turned into wetlands fed by glacial melt. To them, the land was alive and unpredictable. The earth did not feel permanent, but restless, reshaped by forces beyond comprehension. The myths they carried, of floods, of moving mountains, of spirits shaping the land, may well be rooted in these lived experiences. Even now, we live within the legacy of the ice. The shape of modern coastlines, the distribution of rivers, the fertility of farmlands, and the abundance of fresh water are all gifts of glaciers. Without their carving and grinding, without their floods and their soils, human civilizations would have been born on a very different Earth. The age of ice was not only an age of cold, but an age of transformation, in which the planet itself was sculpted into the form we inhabit today. And the story of that shaping does not end here. For the land they carved would soon become the stage for the living world that followed. The Ice Age was a world of contrasts, a patchwork of climates and habitats that shifted with every breath of the glaciers. While ice locked vast regions in silence, other places pulsed with life, some harsh and open, others green and fertile. To understand this age is not only to look at the ice, but to see the living world that flourished in its shadow. Stretching across Eurasia and North America lay the Mammoth Steppe, the largest biome of its time. It was not barren, but rich with grasses, sedges, and flowering plants that thrived in the cold, dry conditions. Hardy herbs clung to the soil, carpeting the plains in colors when summer arrived. These plants had adapted to survive with little water and short growing seasons, their roots binding the ground against winds that blew unhindered for hundreds of kilometers. The result was a sea of grass stretching farther than the eye could see, a land capable of feeding millions of grazing animals. Here roamed the great herds. Woolly mammoths lumbered across the steppe, their thick coats and curved tusks iconic even in their own age. Beside them grazed bison, steppe horses, musk oxen, and reindeer. These herds moved with the seasons, migrating north in summer when the land thawed and grasses flourished, then turning south when snow and frost hardened the plains. Their migrations carved invisible roads across continents, trails followed not only by predators but also by the first humans. The predators of this steppe world were equally impressive. Packs of wolves tracked the herds tirelessly, their endurance unmatched. Cave lions, larger than any lions alive today, stalked in groups, waiting for a chance to strike at the edges of the herds. Saber-toothed cats, with their elongated canines, specialized in ambush, leaping from cover to bring down prey with precision. Even scavengers thrived, from hyenas in Europe to giant short-faced bears in the Americas, towering animals whose sheer size allowed them to claim kills from smaller hunters. Yet the living world of the Ice Age was not limited to the steppe. Farther south, where the glaciers never reached, forests endured. In Europe, oak, birch, and pine spread during warmer intervals, supporting deer, wild boar, and aurochs. In Asia, dense forests of spruce and larch stretched across Siberia, home to moose and elk, as well as smaller creatures like hares and voles. These forests shifted back and forth in size with each cycle, expanding during interglacials, contracting when the cold deepened again. Closer to the equator, the tropics remained green but altered. Africa's savannas supported elephants, giraffes, and antelope, much as they do today, though during colder times deserts spread wider, pressing the rainforests into smaller refuges. South America, divided by the Andes, hosted a bewildering range of life. Giant ground sloths moved slowly across the lowlands, armored glyptodons grazed like living fortresses, and terror birds, relics of an earlier era, still stalked the plains. In Australia, marsupial megafauna flourished. Diprotodons the size of rhinos, kangaroos that stood taller than men, and giant predatory lizards that hunted with stealth. The seas, too, were alive. As ice sheets grew, sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters, exposing new coastlines and shallow shelves. These fertile waters teemed with fish, seals, and whales that followed seasonal migrations. Along the shores, seabirds nested in vast colonies, feeding on the abundance stirred by shifting currents. Even as glaciers reshaped the land, the oceans pulsed with their own cycles of life, feeding human populations that learned to gather shellfish and hunt along tidal flats. The living world was resilient, but it was not static. Species rose and fell with the climate, shifting ranges to follow the changing habitats. Reindeer thrived along the edges of the ice, their hooves adapted for snow and tundra. Horses flourished on the steppe, but when forests spread during interglacials, their numbers dwindled. Mammoths dominated the cold expanses, yet each retreat of ice shrank their territory, isolating them into scattered populations. These shifts were not sudden catastrophes, but slow, relentless pressures that shaped the destiny of every species. Even the smallest plants and animals played their part. The grasses evolved in diverse forms, some tolerant of drought, others of frost. Rodents burrowed beneath the snow, surviving winters that killed larger animals. Insects adapted to seasonal extremes, their cycles tuned to the rhythm of short summers. Each thread of life, from the tiniest seed to the largest predator, wove into the fabric of ecosystems that stretched across continents. For humans moving through these landscapes, the richness of the living world was both opportunity and challenge. Herds offered food, hides, and bone, but they also demanded skill to hunt and courage to follow. Forests provided wood, fruits, and shelter, but they also hid predators. Coastal waters yielded fish and shellfish, yet tides and storms posed constant danger. The Ice Age was never simply about survival in the cold. It was about navigating a living world in constant flux, where abundance and scarcity followed the same cycles as ice and warmth. The beauty of this world lay in its diversity. Vast plains, dense forests, tropical jungles, arid deserts, and icy coasts all coexisted within the same age, shifting like pieces of a puzzle as the climate breathed. For every species that vanished from one region, another emerged elsewhere. For every landscape scoured by glaciers, another flourished just beyond their reach. Life endured not in spite of the Ice Age, but because of it, adapting endlessly to the rhythm of change. The living world of the Ice Age was not simply a collection of creatures scattered across different habitats, but an intricate web of relationships bound together by climate, landscape, and the eternal push of survival. Herds of herbivores shaped the land itself, their migrations trampling paths across the steppe and dispersing seeds that clung to their fur or passed through their bodies. Predators followed these trails, keeping populations in check and ensuring that only the strongest survived. Scavengers completed the cycle, reducing carcasses to bone and enriching the soil for plants to grow again. This balance was fragile, yet it held for millennia, sustained by the rhythm of the ice. In the colder reaches, tundra stretched outward, a land of moss, lichen, and hardy shrubs. Though it looked barren, the tundra was alive with creatures adapted to scarcity. Lemmings burrowed beneath the snow, forming the base of a food chain that supported owls, foxes, and stoats. Caribou grazed on lichens, their hooves wide and splayed to move across snow. Arctic hares flashed white against the drifts, while musk oxen huddled in tight groups, their thick coats a defense against brutal winds. To survive here meant not only enduring the cold but thriving in it, and each species had found its niche. South of the tundra, life shifted into greater abundance. The Mammoth Steppe, with its vast grasslands, was the beating heart of the Ice Age biosphere. The density of life here was astonishing. Millions of grazing animals roamed the plains, so numerous that their presence could alter entire ecosystems. Where herds trampled the ground, grasses regrew thicker, fertilized by dung and churned by hooves. Fire, sparked by lightning, occasionally swept across the plains, clearing old growth and allowing fresh plants to flourish. This cycle of grazing and regrowth maintained a balance that supported not just the herbivores, but the predators that shadowed them. The predators were varied and formidable. Wolves and cave lions relied on cooperation, hunting in packs or prides to bring down larger prey. The saber-toothed cats were ambush specialists, their long canines designed for a precise fatal strike. The giant short-thighed bear of the Americas, taller than any man when standing upright, roamed as a dominant scavenger, able to drive away almost any competitor from a kill. Even birds joined the ranks. Condors, vultures, and eagles soared above, watching for the signs of weakness that meant opportunity. This interplay between hunter and hunted shaped every decision, every migration, every adaptation in the living world. Forests, though smaller in the colder intervals, remained vital refuges. When the ice retreated, they surged northward, filling valleys with birch, oak, and pine. In these shadowed places, different dramas unfolded. Deer slipped through the trees, wild boar rooted in the soil, and aurochs, the ancestors of modern cattle, moved in herds, powerful and unpredictable. Lynx and wildcats stalked silently, their padded feet leaving no sound. Owls hunted in darkness, while woodpeckers tapped rhythms into the bark. Insects, hidden from the larger dramas of the steppe, pollinated flowers, spread seeds, and sustained the forest in quiet ways. Farther still, where warmth endured year-round, rainforests of Africa and South America remained, though their ranges contracted in colder times. These forests pulsed with life, monkeys leaping between branches, parrots flashing color through the canopy, and jaguars moving like shadows along rivers. In South America, the Ice Age rainforests were neighbors to plains where giant sloths grazed and glyptodons lumbered, armored in shells of bone. The diversity of life here stood in contrast to the sparrow ecosystems of the north, yet both were bound to the same global rhythm, expanding and shrinking as climate dictated. The oceans, too, carried this rhythm. Lower sea levels exposed new coastlines, creating habitats for seals, walruses, and seabirds. Whales followed their ancient migratory routes, drawn by blooms of plankton stirred by shifting currents along the edges of ice sheets. Cold, nutrient-rich waters welled upward, feeding vast schools of fish that in turn fed entire ecosystems. For humans exploring these coasts, the sea was a gift of constant renewal, a source of food less fickle than the herds inland. It became a frontier where survival meant understanding tides, seasons, and the behavior of animals that lived beyond land. One of the most remarkable qualities of the Ice Age living world was its resilience. Life adapted not just to survive, but to flourish in conditions that shifted over spans of centuries. Plants evolved to grow quickly in short summers. Animals grew thick coats, stored fat, or developed migrations that carried them across continents. Even insects and birds adjusted their cycles, syncing with the rhythm of freezing and thawing. This resilience meant that when environments changed, when forests gave way to plains, or plains to tundra, life moved with it, rearranging itself, but rarely vanishing entirely. Yet resilience had limits. Some species thrived only in narrow conditions, and when those conditions disappeared, so did they. The woolly rhinoceros, adapted to cold steppe, struggled as warmth returned and forests spread. The giant ground sloths of South America could not adapt to new pressures when humans entered their world. Each disappearance was a reminder that adaptation was not universal, and that the living world was shaped as much by loss as by abundance. Still, the Ice Age remains one of the most vibrant periods in Earth's history, a time when ecosystems stretched across the globe in a patchwork of contrasts. Tundra beside forest, desert beside grassland, ice beside jungle. It was a world alive with tension and beauty, with herds and predators, with growth and decline. The land carried scars of glaciers, but upon those scars life wove its endless patterns. This was the stage on which humanity itself found its place, learning not only to endure but to read the signs of animals, plants, and seasons. The living world of the Ice Age was not static, it was in constant motion, and into that motion humans stepped, becoming part of the balance, reshaping it in turn, even as the Earth prepared to shift again. They were the heartbeat of the Ice Age world. Across the vastness of the Mammoth Steppe, stretching from the Atlantic shores of Europe through Siberia and over the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, herds moved in numbers so great they seemed to merge with the land itself. The glaciers carved the stage, but it was the animals who filled it with life, their migrations a living tide that shaped everything from the soil beneath their feet to the fate of human survival. Imagine standing on a ridge in what is now central Russia, the wind cutting across an endless plain. Below, the earth ripples with motion. Woolly mammoths lumber in steady lines, their long tusks swinging like pale scythes as they push aside snow in search of grass. Bison graze in restless clusters, their shaggy heads buried deep in the tough sedges of winter. Reindeer form flowing rivers of antlers, moving with uncanny unity across the horizon. Interspersed among them are wild horses, compact and muscular, their hooves drumming the frozen ground like thunder. Musk oxen cluster in protective rings, calves hidden in the center, adults forming an armored wall of horns and wool. The scale is overwhelming. From horizon to horizon, the land breathes with animals and the air is alive with sound. The low grumbles of mammoths, the snorts of horses, the deep rumble of hooves echoing across the steppe. These were not isolated herds, they were ecosystems in motion, each migration carrying with it the seeds of new plants, the predators that followed, and the people who depended on their rhythm. The Mammoth Steppe was no barren wasteland. Its grasses and flowering herbs, adapted to cold and drought, flourished in soils rich with minerals ground from rock by glaciers. These plants fueled the herds, and the herds in turn fueled the land. Their trampling hooves churned the soil, their dung fertilized it, and their migrations prevented shrubs and trees from taking over. Without them, the steppe would have been transformed into something else entirely. With them, it became one of the most productive ecosystems Earth has ever known. Of all the great herd animals, the woolly mammoth stood as the icon. Towering more than 3 meters at the shoulder, cloaked in thick coats of dark fur, they were perfectly adapted to the cold. Their long, curved tusks, sometimes more than 4 meters in length, could sweep snow aside to uncover hidden grasses, and their social bonds made them formidable. Led by experienced matriarchs, mammoth herds were families, each generation learning from the last. They traveled with purpose, not just instinct but memory guiding their steps. To early humans, they were both awe-inspiring and indispensable, creatures whose meat, fat, bone, and hide could sustain life through the cruelest winter. Beside them moved the bison, perhaps even more numerous, larger than the bison that roam today. With sweeping horns and heavy forequarters, these animals gathered in herds of thousands. When startled, their stampede shook the earth, a force of nature that could crush predators and overwhelm hunters. Yet their abundance also meant opportunity. For wolves, lions, and humans alike, the bison were a cornerstone of survival. Every part of their body had purpose, from food to tools to shelter, and their presence across the steppe made them a constant in the lives of all who shared the land. The wild horses brought another energy to the plains. Short, stocky, and covered in thick winter coats, they were survivors, enduring harsh winds and scarce forage with resilience. Their herds were fluid, breaking apart and reforming with startling speed, a strategy that baffled predators and gave them an edge in survival. For humans, the horse was both food and symbol, its image etched into cave walls with reverence. Long before it became a partner in domestication, it was a source of meat and bone, a gift of the steppe that demanded respect and skill to hunt. Reindeer, tireless and swift, added another rhythm. Their seasonal migrations were among the longest of any land animal, carrying them north in summer to graze on the rich tundra, then south in winter to escape the deep snow. Their antlers, borne by both males and females, marked them out as unique, and their adaptations, broad hooves for snow, fur that trapped heat, made them the quintessential creatures of the ice. To humans, they were more than prey. They were companions of survival, their movements guiding the movements of people, their hides and bones shaping tools, clothing, and shelter. The musk oxen were the strongholds of the steppe. They did not migrate as far as others, but their defense was unity. When threatened, they locked together in circles, horns outward, protecting their calves at all costs. Few predators dared challenge such a fortress. Their wool, finer than cashmere, trapped warmth even in brutal cold, and their endurance symbolized the quiet strength of life in the Ice Age. What bound all these creatures together was not only the land, but the constant motion that defined their existence. The great herds moved because the land required it. Grasses withered under snow, rivers froze, and winds swept bare the plains. To stay still was to starve. To move was to live. And in moving they reshaped the world, cutting trails across continents, spreading seeds in their fur, pressing their presence into the soil. Predators followed, birds circled overhead, and humans learned to walk in their shadow. Theirs was a partnership forged not by choice, but by necessity, each bound to the other in the frozen theater of the Ice Age. The herds were not only a spectacle of abundance, they were the foundation of entire ecosystems. Where they roamed, they left fertility behind. Their hooves churned the soil, mixing organic matter into the ground. Their dung fed insects and enriched the land, giving rise to grasses that would feed them again in the next season. In this way, the herds became both consumers and creators, sustaining the very plains they grazed upon. Remove them, and the steppe would lose its balance. With them, the cycle of life continued in harmony, generation after generation. Predators depended utterly on this cycle. Wolves adapted to endurance hunting, following bison and reindeer until exhaustion slowed the weakest. Cave lions, larger than their modern descendants, relied on teamwork, striking in coordinated bursts at the edges of the herds. Saber-toothed cats chose ambush, hiding near rivers or rocky outcrops where animals gathered. Each predator had its strategy, and each strategy existed only because the herds were there to sustain them. Even scavengers like hyenas and giant vultures thrived, waiting for kills to be made or for the slow to fall behind. The air above the herds often swirled with wings, a reminder that death shadowed life at every step. For humans, the herds were more than survival. They were a way of life. A single mammoth could provide enough food, bone, and hide for an entire band to endure the depths of winter. Bison supplied thick hides for clothing and shelters, sinew for thread, and horns that could be fashioned into tools. Reindeer offered everything from meat to antler to fur. Hunting these animals was never easy. It required cooperation, planning, and courage, but the rewards shaped cultures. Cave paintings of bison and horses in France, of mammoths and reindeer in Spain, were not mere decoration, but acts of memory and reverence. They were reminders of the bond between people and the herds, acknowledgments of the lives taken and the lives given in return. Migration routes of animals became migration routes for humans. To survive meant to follow, step for step, the rhythm of the plains. It was likely this pursuit that carried people across Beringia into the Americas, shadowing mammoths and bison into new lands. With every move, humans adapted their tools, their shelters, their strategies, expanding not only their range but their imagination. The herds were teachers as much as they were prey, showing humans the importance of endurance, cooperation, and timing. They shaped not only the body but the mind of humanity. The abundance of the great herds created landscapes alive with energy. Plains that might otherwise have lain silent became vibrant, filled with motion and sound. The predators sharpened their skills, the scavengers cleaned the remains, the plants thrived under constant grazing, and humans found meaning in the cycles of pursuit. This web of interdependence gave the Ice Age its vitality, making it an era not of desolation but of richness. And yet, the herds were also vulnerable. Their lives were tied tightly to the grasslands, and those grasslands to the climate. A shift in temperature or rainfall could shrink their ranges, forcing them into smaller refuges. For predators and humans, this meant scarcity, competition, and sometimes desperation. For the animals themselves, it meant decline, even extinction, when conditions shifted too far. But in their prime, they seemed limitless, their migrations endless, their presence defining the identity of continents. To walk the Mammoth Steppe was to walk in the shadow of greatness, surrounded by living tides of flesh and bone that gave the Ice Age its pulse. The great herds were more than animals. They were the memory of a world in constant motion, the lifeblood of ecosystems, the companions of predators and people alike. Their legacy remains not only in the fossils preserved in permafrost, not only in the art painted on cave walls, but in the very landscapes they once transformed. The trails they carved became valleys and passes, the soils they nourished became fields, and the lessons they inspired carried forward into human history. In their abundance, they showed what the earth could sustain. In their vulnerability, they revealed how fragile that balance could be. And in their endless movement, they embodied the essence of the Ice Age itself, a world defined by motion, shaped by rhythm, and alive with the thunder of hoofs. They were not merely hunters. In the frozen world of the Ice Age, predators were sculptors of survival, forces that shaped the behavior of prey, ecosystems, and even humans themselves. To follow the story of the predators is to see the Ice Age not through the herds, but through the eyes of those who depended on weakness, strategy, and timing. The cave lion was among the greatest. Larger than any lion alive today, it was a cat without a mane, sleek and muscular, with a body built for pursuit across the open steppe. In packs, they rivaled wolves for coordination, ambushing prey with speed that belied their size. Yet, unlike modern lions, cave lions often lived in small groups rather than great prides. Their fossils, found deep in European caves, suggest they sometimes denned in the same dark places that humans would later decorate with paintings. For the people who lived alongside them, the lion was both rival and symbol, an animal of power immortalized in ochre lines on cave walls. These depictions were not simple records. They were acts of reverence, acknowledgments of the predator's role in the eternal cycle. The saber-toothed cats carried a different presence. Their elongated canines, up to 20 centimeters long, were not tools of brute force, but of precision. Unlike lions or wolves, they did not chase prey for long distances. They relied on ambush, lurking in cover near rivers or low forests, waiting for the right moment. Their bodies were powerful but not built for endurance, meaning that each strike had to succeed. For humans, encountering them, they must have seemed like phantoms of violence, appearing from nowhere with an elegance that ended in blood. The fossils of their jaws tell us of their specialization, their risk. Teeth so large and fragile that one miscalculated bite could spell death. They were hunters balanced on the knife's edge of evolution. Among the canids, wolves dominated. Their endurance, stamina, and cooperation made them among the most successful hunters of the Ice Age. But these were not wolves as we know them today. Some were massive, with broader skulls and stronger jaws, adapted to bring down large herbivores like bison and reindeer. Others were the ancestors of our domestic dogs, gradually shifting from wary competitors of humans to companions at the fire. This was no sudden partnership. It unfolded over millennia, as wolves and humans recognized reflections of themselves in each other. Hunters that relied on cooperation, patience, and strategy. The path from rival to ally began in the Ice Age, a transformation that would change the course of both species forever. The giant short-fayed bear was the shadow that loomed over the Americas. Taller than any man, weighing more than half a ton, it was not merely a predator, but a tyrant of the plains. Its long legs were built for running, yet many scientists believe it survived more by intimidation than by pursuit. When other predators killed, the bear arrived, its size alone enough to drive them away. For humans entering the Americas, this creature was a terror, a beast that claimed what others had earned. And yet it was also vulnerable, too specialized, too dependent on its dominance. As ecosystems shifted and prey grew scarcer, its size became a burden rather than an advantage. But the great predators were not the only hunters. The Ice Age was alive with smaller carnivores, each adapted to their niche. Lynx and wildcats stalked the forests, their silent paws leaving no trace on snow. Stoats, weasels, and martens scurried through undergrowth, preying on rodents that themselves shaped the base of the food chain. Birds of prey, owls, hawks, and eagles scanned the tundra, diving in silence to snatch hares or lemmings. Scavenger birds wheeled above the steppe, watching the herds for weakness. Even the insects had their predators, beetles and ants that thrived on decay, turning death into fuel for life. Every layer of the Ice Age food web had its hunters, from the vast to the microscopic, each bound together by the pursuit of survival. For humans, predators were both competitors and teachers. The presence of wolves circling a herd could mean danger, but also opportunity. A lion's kill could become a feast for a band bold enough to steal it. The behavior of predators revealed the movements of prey, and early hunters often followed not just animals, but the predators that tracked them. This uneasy relationship was one of mirroring and learning. Just as wolves adapted to human presence, so too did humans adapt to the tactics of predators, refining their own strategies of endurance, ambush, and cooperation. In a sense, predators forced humans to evolve, not only in body, but in mind. Myth and imagination elevated these animals beyond the physical. In caves across Europe, lions and mammoths share the walls, but it is the predators that are given symbolic weight. Painted with careful strokes, they appear as guardians, rivals, or even spirits of the hunt. The saber-toothed cat may have been remembered not only for its teeth, but for its suddenness, a symbol of the danger lurking unseen. Wolves, long before domestication, were likely feared and admired in equal measure, their howls carrying across the plains like voices of the night. To live in the Ice Age was to live in a landscape where predators were never far, shaping not only survival, but also the stories told by firelight. The dynamics of predator-prey shape landscapes in ways less visible but equally profound. By keeping herbivore populations in check, predators prevented overgrazing. Their kills provided carrion that fed scavengers, insects, and enriched the soil itself. In this way, they were not destroyers but maintainers of balance, the sharp edge that kept the rhythm intact. Even humans, who would one day tip that balance irrevocably, were once bound by it, another species in the great web of pursuit and escape. Some predators adapted with extraordinary resilience. Wolves, for instance, survived the end of the Ice Age when saber-toothed cats and cave lions vanished. Their flexibility in diet and behavior allowed them to endure where specialists failed. The great cats, magnificent but narrow in their ecological roles, disappeared as climates warmed and prey shifted. The bear that once towered over the plains fell to scarcity and competition. The story of Ice Age predators is not only one of might, but of fragility, of species balanced so delicately on their niches that the smallest change could erase them from the earth. And yet, their presence endures in us. We carry echoes of their shapes in myths, in symbols, in our own domesticated companions. The partnership forged between human and wolf is one of the most enduring legacies of the Ice Age, reshaping the destiny of both species. The fear of lions and bears lives on in our stories, our warnings, our symbols of power. The fascination with saber-toothed cats survives in the awe they still inspire, long after their extinction. Predators of the ice were never just animals. They were forces of nature, reflections of danger and strength that carved themselves into human memory. The Ice Age was a stage where survival played out with sharp teeth and silent pursuit. Predators sharpened the world, demanded adaptation, and forced every creature to move, to learn, to endure. For humanity, they were rivals, teachers, and eventually companions. For the Earth itself, they were the stewards of balance, shaping life as much as glaciers shaped land. And in their rise and fall, they left behind a truth as old as the hunt itself. Survival belongs not to the strongest alone, but to those who can adapt when the world changes. The Ice Age was a crucible for humanity. To exist in its frozen landscapes meant not only enduring the cold, but mastering it. Survival required ingenuity, cooperation, and resilience. Each band of humans moved through a world of shifting challenges: scarcity of food, predators in the dark, storms that stripped away warmth in moments. Yet from these hardships emerged some of the most defining traits of our species. Clothing was among the first necessities. Without protection, no human could survive the sub-zero nights of the steppe or tundra. Animal hides became lifelines, scraped and softened with stone tools, stitched with sinew into cloaks, leggings, and boots. Reindeer and bison provided skins that insulated against the cold, while mammoth hides, immense and thick, could be stretched into coverings for shelters. Archaeological finds suggest garments layered with fur, facing inward, trapping warmth against the body. The invention of tailored clothing was not a luxury, but a barrier between life and death. Shelter was equally vital. Humans of the Ice Age did not simply wander the open plains. They built with what the land allowed. In forested regions, huts of wood and bark shielded them from wind. On the treeless steppes, mammoth bones became frames for dwellings, covered with hides to create warm enclosures. Some groups sought refuge in caves, where the rock offered protection. Though fire was needed to drive away the chill, these spaces were not just shelters but homes. Places where families gathered, children learned, and traditions formed. Fire itself was humanity's greatest ally. It gave warmth in the coldest nights, light in the darkest caves, and safety from predators whose eyes glowed at the edge of the flames. More than survival, fire became a center of culture. Around it, stories were spoken, songs hummed, ideas shared. It transformed raw meat into nourishment, sinew into pliable thread, and stone into harder tools when heated. Archaeological evidence of hearths stretching back tens of thousands of years speaks of continuity. Fire not as discovery, but as constant companion. Tools evolved in tandem with need. Stone was chipped into blades sharp enough to cut hides or carve bone. Spears tipped with flint became hunting weapons capable of piercing thick hides. Later, the invention of the atlatl, a spear thrower, extended human reach, allowing prey to be struck from a safer distance. Bones of mammoth and reindeer became needles, awls, and ornaments. Nothing was wasted. Marrow was cracked from bones, fat rendered into lamps. Each item carried knowledge, passed from one generation to the next, embedding experience into material culture. Social bonds deepened under these conditions. To hunt a mammoth required cooperation. To endure a storm required sharing of food and shelter. Alone, a human was vulnerable. Together, they were formidable. The Ice Age taught humanity that survival was collective. Archaeological evidence of care for the sick and injured, individuals who lived long after crippling wounds, reveals compassion as well as pragmatism. To keep one alive who could no longer hunt meant valuing not just strength, but wisdom, memory, and kinship. Art began to emerge in this crucible. Carvings on bone, lines painted in red ochre, animals traced on cave walls. These were not idle expressions. They were reflections of a mind learning to shape the world symbolically. Whether they carried spiritual meaning, hunting magic, or simple storytelling, they marked the beginning of imagination recorded. The Ice Age gave humanity not only challenges, but the impetus to express, to remember, to dream. To walk through this frozen world as a human was to live in constant awareness of danger and wonder alike. Every step was uncertain, yet every success reinforced ingenuity: fire, clothing, shelter, tools. These were more than technologies, they were extensions of the human will to endure. And in the cold, endurance became identity. Life in the Ice Age demanded more than physical adaptation. It required resilience of mind. The cold was relentless, food uncertain, and threats constant. Yet humans found ways not just to survive, but to thrive. One of the most powerful tools was memory. The land itself was a map, its rivers, valleys, and animal trails etched into collective knowledge. Elders carried these maps in their minds, passing them down in stories and lessons. To know where the herds crossed, where berries ripened in summer, or where safe shelters lay could mean the difference between life and death. These oral traditions were the earliest libraries, stored not in books, but in human memory, spoken by firelight, repeated until they became part of culture. Rituals also emerged in this world of uncertainty. Burial sites from the Ice Age reveal not only the practical act of laying bodies to rest, but evidence of ceremony: red ochre sprinkled over the dead, tools placed beside them, beads carved from bone. These gestures suggest belief in something beyond survival, perhaps an afterlife, perhaps respect for ancestors. In the harshest of environments, humans sought meaning, creating bonds with the unseen as much as with each other. Ritual became a form of resilience, a way to impose order on the chaos of ice and storm. Hunting, though dangerous, was not reckless. It was calculated, planned with patience and coordination. Hunters studied herds, learned to predict movements, and exploited terrain. Groups would drive animals into ravines, toward waiting spears, or into marshes where their size became a hindrance. Persistence hunting, chasing prey until exhaustion, was sometimes employed, a test of endurance as much for humans as for the animals. These hunts forged unity, teaching cooperation and strategy, sharpening the mind as well as the body. But survival did not rest solely on hunting. Gathering plants, nuts, roots, and berries remained crucial, particularly for groups in regions where herds thinned or forests dominated. Women, children, and elders often shouldered this work, their knowledge of edible plants, medicinal herbs, and seasonal cycles forming another foundation of survival. Together, hunting and gathering created a balance, spreading risk across the seasons. This division of labor, rooted in necessity, wove community together. As humans endured the cold, they also innovated socially. Families clustered into bands, bands into tribes, forming networks that could share resources, exchange mates, and pass along skills. The cold demanded connection beyond immediate kin, fostering cooperation on a larger scale. These alliances shaped the earliest forms of human society, built not on walls or cities, but on trust, reciprocity, and the shared struggle against the ice. Language itself grew under these conditions. To coordinate hunts, to teach children, to preserve knowledge, humans needed words. The complexity of Ice Age survival spurred the complexity of communication. Every plan, every story, every ritual demanded clarity. Language became as essential as fire or stone, enabling humans to bind together in ways no other predator or prey could match. It was in these winters, perhaps, that humanity's voice truly found its shape. The Ice Age also demanded mobility. Camps could not be fixed forever, for resources shifted with the seasons. Groups followed herds, moved between summer and winter shelters, or migrated when conditions grew too harsh. Mobility meant adaptability. It meant lightness, carrying only what could be transported, crafting tools that could serve multiple purposes. It forged a culture of movement, a rhythm of life tied not to permanence but to flow. This way of life prepared humans for expansion into new territories, teaching them to adapt swiftly when faced with the unfamiliar. Art, ritual, memory, cooperation, all these flourished in the crucible of cold. The Ice Age was not merely endured but transformed by human presence. Our ancestors turned survival into culture, danger into innovation, scarcity into community. Each fire lit, each shelter built, each tool shaped was not only a defense against the cold, but a declaration of existence. The world pressed hard against them, yet they pressed back with creativity, courage, and connection. Humanity in the cold was not diminished, but defined. They stood at the edge of a continent that was not yet separate. Before them lay a horizon of tundra and ice, stretching farther than the eye could see. Behind them, the familiar plains of Siberia. Ahead, a land no human had yet claimed. This was Beringia, a bridge not of stone or timber, but of earth itself. Exposed when seas fell more than 100 meters, a frozen highway between Asia and the Americas. It was a place of extremes, but also of opportunity, and across its expanse, the first great migrations into new worlds began. Beringia was not a narrow strip. At its fullest, it stretched nearly 1,500 kilometers wide, a vast plain linking continents. It was not all ice, as one might imagine, but a patchwork of steppe, tundra, and river valleys. Grasses and herbs grew in abundance, sustained by soils rich in minerals ground from glacial rock. Mammoths and bison grazed its plains, reindeer migrated across its ridges, and predators shadowed them as they did everywhere else. For humans, it was not an empty corridor, but a living land, harsh yet capable of sustaining those who dared to cross. The timing of these migrations has long been debated, but evidence suggests that humans began moving into Beringia at least 25,000 years ago, perhaps earlier. During the height of the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets sealed much of northern North America, people may have lingered on the bridge itself, isolated for millennia in a cold refuge of grasslands and rivers. This Beringian standstill theory proposes that humans lived there for thousands of years, adapting to the unique conditions before spreading farther. Genetic evidence supports this. Lineages found in indigenous peoples of the Americas trace back to a population that was long separated from both Asia and Europe, a people shaped by the isolation of Beringia. Crossing was never a single event. It was a movement repeated over generations, family by family, band by band, pressing slowly into new lands. Some groups may have turned back, retreating into Siberia when conditions grew too harsh. Others pressed forward, their paths determined by ice sheets that rose like walls across the continent. For much of the last glacial maximum, the way south was blocked. Massive glaciers, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran, joined to form an impassable barrier stretching thousands of kilometers. The Americas lay open beyond, but for a time they were unreachable. It was climate that decided the course. As the ice began to retreat around 15,000 years ago, corridors opened. One route followed the edge of the Pacific coast, where glaciers melted into fjords and shorelines became highways. Here, travelers may have built skin boats, hunted seals, and gathered shellfish, moving southward along a corridor of kelp forests that fed fish and birds in abundance. Archaeological finds on islands from Alaska to Chile hint at this path, suggesting that humans reached the southern tip of South America astonishingly quickly, perhaps within only a few centuries after the ice began to withdraw. The other route was inland, a corridor between the retreating Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets. Once barren and locked in ice, it gradually filled with vegetation, rivers, and game, offering a path for those moving south. Through this gateway, humans spread into the heart of North America, reaching the plains where mammoths grazed and bison stampeded. Evidence from sites like the Bluefish Caves in the Yukon or the Buttermilk Creek complex in Texas suggests that humans may have entered earlier than once thought, challenging the old idea of a Clovis-first migration. The story is now one of multiple waves, overlapping paths, and resilience in the face of immense obstacles. Each step into the Americas was a step into the unknown. The landscapes were unlike those of Siberia. Great herds roamed, but so too did predators unfamiliar to the migrants: dire wolves, giant bears, and saber-toothed cats. The rivers flowed differently, the stars shone over new horizons, the plants and animals required new knowledge to use. For every group that succeeded, others may have faltered, their traces lost to the ice and time. Yet the persistence of humanity carried them forward until footprints were pressed into South American soil and the entire continent became part of the human world. Migration was not only expansion, but isolation. Once the ice closed behind them, many groups were cut off from their homelands forever. Generations passed with no memory of Siberia, no knowledge of the continent still connected far behind. Languages evolved, traditions diverged, and new cultures were born in landscapes never before touched by humans. In the Andean highlands, people adapted to thin air and steep valleys. On the North American plains, they mastered the rhythms of bison herds. Along coasts, they learned the wealth of the sea. From a single crossing, diversity unfolded, creating civilizations that would one day rise from these Ice Age foundations. The evidence of these journeys lies not only in artifacts, but in bones, genes, and even legends. Stone tools found in caves across both continents tell of skilled craftsmanship. DNA preserved in ancient remains reveals connections across time and distance, linking the first peoples of the Americas to their ancestors in Asia. Oral traditions, carried forward for millennia, speak of long journeys, of landscapes crossed, of ancestors who came from the north. These stories echo the science, carrying memory deeper than archaeology alone can reach. The migration into the Americas was one of humanity's boldest steps, not because it was fast or dramatic, but because it required persistence across centuries. It was not a conquest in the sense of armies and battles, but a slow diffusion of families seeking food, safety, and possibility. Each campfire lit in the darkness marked another foothold in a new world, another page in the unfolding story of adaptation. Beringia faded beneath the sea as glaciers melted and sea levels rose, erasing the bridge forever. What had once been a continent-sized highway is now a strait of water, but beneath those waves lies the memory of footsteps, of lives lived in the liminal space between old and new worlds. As humans spread deeper into the Americas, the landscapes themselves shaped their destinies. Mountains, rivers, and deserts acted not only as barriers, but as forges of culture, pressing each community into new forms of life. On the high plateaus of the Andes, people learned to endure thin air and steep valleys, hunting camelids like guanaco and vicuña, their lungs and blood gradually adapting to the altitude. In the open plains of North America, groups followed bison herds, their movements syncing with the rhythms of migration and grassland. Along coasts, shell middens grew as people turned to the sea, harvesting fish, seals, and seabirds in cycles that mirrored the tides. Isolation soon deepened these adaptations. Rising seas closed Beringia, cutting off contact with Asia forever. What had once been a corridor became an ocean, and those who had crossed were now alone in a world that was wholly their own. Languages diverged, technologies split, and myths took root in the soils of new homelands. Over thousands of years, this diversity grew into hundreds of distinct cultures, each tuned to the demands of its environment, yet all linked by the common journey that had carried their ancestors across the ice. Climate shifts continued to dictate the terms of survival. In some regions, warming brought forests that spread into former grasslands, forcing hunters to change strategies and tools. In others, droughts shrank rivers and lakes, pressing groups into tighter competition. The land itself was not stable. It pulsed with the rhythm of the ice. For those who lived upon it, every change required adaptation, every generation a new negotiation with the shifting earth. Still, evidence of resilience is everywhere. Tools crafted from stone unique to certain valleys show the spread of trade across vast distances. Rock shelters in South America preserve pigments and engravings that echo memories of journeys and spirits. In North America, ancient campsites contain traces of meals, fires, and the daily lives of families. These fragments reveal a pattern, people not merely surviving, but embedding themselves into the land, shaping and being shaped by it. The crossing of worlds was not only physical but cultural. What began as a movement across a land bridge became the foundation of entirely new histories. From Alaska to Patagonia, every environment drew out different possibilities, each group carving meaning from ice, forest, desert, and coast. In time, the diversity born of isolation would produce civilizations, but in the Ice Age, it was the first footsteps, the first fires, the first stories in unfamiliar lands that mattered most. The memory of the crossing still lingers. Genetic patterns trace the journey, archaeological sites mark its milestones, and oral traditions carry echoes of long migrations. To follow this story is to see humanity at its most determined, pressing into the unknown, adapting at every turn, and leaving behind a map written not in ink but in bones, camps, and trails. And while Beringia lies drowned beneath the sea, the world it connected remains alive, with the legacy of those who walked its frozen plains, stepping into landscapes that would soon be called their own. Stretching across continents, from the edges of Western Europe to the coast of Alaska, from the frozen plains of Siberia to the valleys of the Yukon, there once existed the largest biome of the Ice Age, the Mammoth Steppe. It was not a single plain, nor a single environment, but a vast tapestry of grassland ecosystems woven together across half the northern hemisphere. For tens of thousands of years, it was the most productive land on Earth, capable of sustaining megafauna in numbers unimaginable today. At first glance, the Mammoth Steppe might appear desolate, treeless, windswept, with soil locked by permafrost. Yet this apparent barrenness concealed extraordinary fertility. The cold, dry climate created a unique balance. Snow did not fall in suffocating amounts, and summers, though short, were intense bursts of light that fueled grasses, herbs, and flowering plants. The soil, enriched by minerals ground from glaciers, supported a vast carpet of hardy vegetation. Unlike forests, which lock nutrients into trunks and leaves for decades, the grasses of the steppe recycled energy quickly. Year after year they returned, providing endless forage for herbivores. This productivity meant abundance. Scientists call the Mammoth Steppe the Ice Age Serengeti, and the comparison is not exaggeration. Where Africa's savannas today support herds of zebra, wildebeest, and antelope, the Ice Age steppe supported mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, bison, reindeer, musk oxen, and steppe horses. Fossil evidence suggests that densities of grazing animals may have rivaled or even surpassed those of modern African plains. The sheer scale of these herds was not an exception but a rule, a rhythm sustained by the balance of grass and grazer. The steppe was not uniform. In some areas, moss and lichen dominated, creating tundra-like conditions. In others, flowering herbs spread across summer meadows, drawing insects and birds. Along rivers, willows and shrubs provided shelter and forage, while valleys carved by glaciers acted as corridors for migration. Each niche supported species adapted precisely to it, creating a biome both resilient and dynamic. What made the Mammoth Steppe remarkable was not only its scale but its stability. For nearly 100,000 years, through cycles of ice advance and retreat, it persisted. As glaciers grew, forests retreated, leaving more ground open for grasslands. As glaciers shrank, forests returned, but never fully erased the steppe. It was a biome born of cold, but not wholly dependent on it, thriving in the margins where ice and warmth met. For humans, the Mammoth Steppe was both a challenge and a gift. The openness made travel easier than in forests, allowing groups to follow animals over long distances. At the same time, its exposure left little shelter from wind and storm. Yet the abundance of grazing animals meant food, clothing, and tools in constant supply. Archaeological sites across Siberia and Eastern Europe show that humans settled along river valleys, exploiting the richness of the steppe while finding refuge in caves and shelters built from mammoth bone. Here, the steppe was not a wasteland. It was a home, as essential to human survival as it was to mammoths themselves. The rhythm of the steppe was simple yet profound. Grazers shaped the vegetation by constant feeding. Predators shaped the grazers by culling the weak. Scavengers cleaned the remains, and their activity enriched the soil further. Even the climate played its role. Dry winds carried dust that fertilized distant regions, while cold air preserved nutrients in the ground. This system was self-sustaining, a web of life so vast that it seemed unshakable. But no system lasts forever, and the Mammoth Steppe was no exception. The decline of the Mammoth Steppe was gradual, yet irreversible. As the Ice Age began to wane, around 20,000 years ago, temperatures rose and glaciers retreated. With them came moisture, and with moisture came forests. Birch and pine advanced into lands once ruled by grasses, shading out the herbs and sedges that had fed herds for millennia. The soil, once frozen and stable, grew wetter as permafrost melted, turning stretches of plain into bog and marsh. For animals adapted to dry grasslands, this was not renewal, but loss. Mammoths, once icons of the biome, found their ranges shrinking. Woolly rhinoceroses dependent on steppe grasses faced the same decline. Reindeer retreated northward, bison shifted their ranges, and steppe horses dwindled. Some populations clung to isolated refuges, mammoths surviving on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean until only 4,000 years ago. But the great continuous expanse of the steppe was gone. The collapse of the biome rippled outward. Predators, once abundant, lost their prey base. Lions and saber-toothed cats declined, giant bears vanished, and even wolves, though survivors, were forced to adapt to new niches. For humans, the change brought both challenges and opportunities. In some regions, forests provided new resources, timber, fruit, smaller game. But the abundance of great herds was gone. Cultures shifted, technologies changed, and in time humans began experimenting with new ways of survival. The planting of seeds, the herding of animals, the first steps toward agriculture. The loss of the Mammoth Steppe remains one of the greatest ecological transformations in Earth's history. Where once a biome spanned continents, today only fragments remain, echoes in Arctic tundra and subarctic grasslands. Scientists study these remnants, drilling into permafrost, analyzing pollen, reconstructing the lost ecosystems from bones and soil. Some even dream of restoring parts of it, a concept called Pleistocene rewilding, where species like bison, horses, and even cloned mammoths might one day recentrate the steppe's ecological function. Yet even without revival, the legacy of the Mammoth Steppe endures. Its fertility-shaped soils that remain rich today. Its dust-fertilized oceans influencing global climate systems. Its animals shaped human culture, inspiring art, myth, and memory. To understand the steppe is to understand the heart of the Ice Age, not as endless ice, but as living, breathing abundance. The Mammoth Steppe teaches that even the greatest systems are fragile. For tens of thousands of years, it endured, seemingly eternal. But a shift in climate, a rise in temperature, a change in rainfall was enough to unravel it. Its disappearance reshaped the world, just as surely as glaciers carved valleys and rivers cut plains. And as the seas rose, swallowing Beringia and transforming coastlines, the Mammoth Steppe too passed into history, leaving behind only traces in fossil beds and memory in human imagination. At the height of the Ice Age, oceans were not what they are today. Vast amounts of water were locked away in glaciers, drawn from seas that shrank back from their shores. Sea levels fell by more than 100 meters, exposing continental shelves, shaping coastlines, and revealing new lands where waves once broke. For tens of thousands of years, the Earth's map looked utterly different, the seas retreating to unveil a hidden world. Where Europe now meets the North Sea, dry plains once stretched across, connecting Britain to the continent. This land, known to modern scientists as Doggerland, was not a barren expanse but a fertile place of rivers, marshes, and rolling hills. Herds of red deer and wild horses grazed there, and human groups built their camps along the streams, leaving tools that fishermen would one day dredge from the seabed. Doggerland was as real a homeland as any valley or steppe until the rising waters swallowed it whole. Elsewhere, entire continents expanded. Southeast Asia was transformed when sea levels dropped, joining the islands of Sumatra, Borneo, and Java into a vast subcontinent called Sundaland. Rivers braided across this land, jungles spread wide, and humans roamed it freely, hunting, gathering, and perhaps even building early networks of exchange. To the south, Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania fused into a single landmass known as Sahul. Humans who had once sailed across narrow straits now walked across plains where seafloor lies today. The Ice Age did not only create barriers of ice, it built bridges of earth, pathways for migration, connection, and survival. The newly exposed coasts were rich with life. Where waters retreated, tidal flats and shallow plains teemed with shellfish and fish, sustaining human groups that learned to exploit the bounty of the sea. Seabirds nested in colonies on cliffs that overlooked plains instead of waves, their guano fertilizing the soils below. Seals, walruses, and whales followed changing coastlines, adjusting their migrations to the altered map. The seas may have shrunk, but they did not vanish. Instead, they redrew the boundaries of life, forcing every species to shift and adapt. Humans living along these shifting shores discovered new opportunities. Coastal hunting and fishing supplemented diets, while land bridges allowed the movement of animals to regions where they had never roamed before. In North America, lowered seas revealed corridors along the Pacific coast, paths that may have guided some of the earliest settlers southward. In Asia, rivers extended far into what are now drowned shelves, offering fertile valleys rich with fish and game. For millennia, people thrived in these landscapes, never knowing that their world was temporary, balanced on the edge of rising seas. Yet nothing remained fixed. As the Ice Age waned and glaciers melted, the oceans stirred. The seas began to rise, slowly at first, then in great surges as ice sheets collapsed into water. Coastlines retreated, valleys filled, and the new lands vanished as swiftly as they had appeared. Entire regions disappeared beneath waves, leaving only memory and myths and traces buried beneath the sea. The drowning of the Ice Age coasts was not a single moment, but a process unfolding over millennia. Still, there were times when the seas rose with shocking speed. Around 14,600 years ago, during an event known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, glaciers collapsed and oceans surged upward by nearly 20 meters in just a few centuries. For the people who lived near the shores, this was not abstract climate. It was a relentless encroachment. Rivers widening, marshes vanishing, and familiar hunting grounds slipping beneath the tide. Doggerland was one of the last to fall. Around 8,000 years ago, a great tsunami triggered by a submarine landslide known as the Storegga Slide swept across the North Sea, drowning settlements and hastening the land's final disappearance. What had once been rivers and hills became seabed, erasing an entire chapter of human geography. Myths of floods, remembered in many cultures, may echo these real events, legacies of generations who witnessed their world consumed by water. In Southeast Asia, Sundaland too was submerged. Valleys that once carried mighty rivers became straits and bays. The Mekong, the Mahakam, and countless others poured into newly formed seas, fragmenting a continent into the archipelago we know today. For human groups who had walked freely across this land, the rising waters must have seemed like the earth itself breaking apart, cutting kin from kin, turning neighbors into islanders separated by waves. Sahul, too, fractured. Rising seas severed Tasmania, isolating its people for millennia. New Guinea split from northern Australia, creating a world of islands where once there had been plains. Each isolation reshaped cultures, languages, and lifeways, driving diversity in the crucible of separation. For the oceans, the changes were equally profound. As shorelines shifted, currents reorganized, redistributing heat and nutrients across the globe. Coral reefs grew and collapsed, adjusting to the new depths. Fisheries changed, reshaping the diets of both animals and humans. Rising seas did not only drown land, they restructured the living ocean itself. The legacy of these drowned worlds remains hidden, yet not entirely lost. Archaeologists recover stone tools, animal bones, and hearths from submerged sites, proof that people once thrived where waves now roll. Advances in sonar and underwater excavation reveal ancient riverbeds, lake basins, and even traces of camps. Beneath the seas lie forgotten homelands, reminders that the Earth's map is never final, that what feels eternal may vanish with the turning of climate. For Ice Age humanity, the changing seas were a force as powerful as glaciers or storms. They offered land, then reclaimed it. They shaped migrations, fostered diversity, and set the stage for new worlds. And as the oceans rose higher, as the last bridges disappeared, people adapted once more, turning inward to rivers, forests, and mountains, even as the tides kept moving forward. High above the plains where mammoths roamed, the air itself carried the record of the Ice Age. Every gust of wind, every drift of snow, every grain of dust was a messenger, storing fragments of a world in flux. Unlike bones or stones which rest in the earth, the atmosphere is restless. It moves, it swirls, it binds continents together. Yet even in its motion, it leaves traces. Clues that tell us not just how the Ice Age looked on the ground, but how it breathed. The atmosphere of the Ice Age was colder, drier, and thinner in its warmth. Levels of carbon dioxide hovered at around 180 parts per million, less than half of today's concentration. This reduction trapped the Earth in cycles of cold, making glaciers advance and seas retreat. But the air was not only cooler, it was dustier. With so much water locked in ice, the land grew arid, rivers shrank, and winds swept freely across exposed shelves and plains. Fine particles of rock, ground to powder by glaciers, lifted into the air and drifted for thousands of kilometers. These clouds of dust settled on ice sheets, oceans, and grasslands, coating the world in a veil of mineral memory. In Antarctica and Greenland, snow fell year after year, trapping bubbles of this ancient air. Over millennia, the layers compressed into ice, forming cores that stretch hundreds of thousands of years into the past. Scientists drilling deep into these frozen archives today extract cylinders of ice that contain tiny pockets of atmosphere, time capsules of the Ice Age. In these bubbles, the balance of gases, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, remains exactly as it was when mammoths grazed and hunters lit their fires. Reading them is like opening a window into vanished skies. Pollen, too, tells the story. Winds carried microscopic grains from plants across continents, depositing them in lakes, bogs, and ice. Layer by layer, sediments collected, preserving these grains as fossils invisible to the eye but clear beneath a microscope. Through them, we know that forests retreated during glacial maxima, shrinking into refuges while steppe grasses spread. We can trace the exact moment when birch and pine advanced again, following the retreat of glaciers. Each shift of pollen is a record not only of climate, but of landscapes lived in by humans, animals, and plants alike. Even the winds themselves left their marks. Loess deposits, thick blankets of silt blown from glacial outwash plains, covered vast areas of Europe, China, and North America. These deposits could reach tens of meters in thickness, forming soils so fertile that they still feed human agriculture today. What began as dust storms in a frozen world became the foundation of future civilizations. The atmosphere was not only a witness, but a sculptor, redistributing the Earth's raw material across continents. To imagine the Ice Age air is to imagine clarity, skies sharp with dryness, horizons stretched by light unfiltered through moisture. But within that clarity was change. Shifts in the tilt and orbit of the planet altered how much sunlight reached different latitudes. These slow rhythms, Milankovitch cycles, tuned the world in and out of glacial phases. The atmosphere followed these cues faithfully, carrying dust, ice, and pollen as evidence of a planet perpetually in motion. The Ice Age atmosphere was not only a recorder of change, it was an engine driving it. When carbon dioxide fell, glaciers advanced. When methane rose from thawing wetlands, warmth returned. Trapped within the balance of gases lay the rhythm of glaciation, subtle yet immense in its impact. Today, scientists read these patterns like notes in a score, rises and falls in CO2, pulses of methane, sharp drops during coldest intervals. Each spike and dip matches the growth or retreat of ice, the expansion of deserts, the flooding of coasts. Volcanoes added their voices to this story. Eruptions sent ash into the sky, blotting out sunlight, cooling the earth in sudden jolts. Layers of volcanic dust are still found in ice cores, matching eruptions to climate swings. Some of these events may have reshaped human journeys, altering where food could grow or herds could move. The sky, though invisible, pressed down on life with consequences as real as any glacier. Dust, gases, and pollen were not isolated signals, but interconnected. When glaciers advanced, the exposed land dried, winds lifted more dust, and oceans received bursts of minerals that fertilized plankton blooms. These blooms in turn pulled carbon dioxide from the air, reinforcing the cold. When glaciers melted, the chain reversed. Forests spread, methane rose from thawing soils, and warmth accelerated. The atmosphere was not a passive archive. It was the pulse of the Ice Age itself. For humans, the air shaped daily life in ways both obvious and subtle. Winds sculpted the land into dunes and ridges, guiding where camps could be built. Dust darkened skies in spring storms, making journeys harder. Cold air limited vegetation, dictating which plants could be gathered and which animals could graze. The very breath of Ice Age humans was filled with air thinner in greenhouse gases, a composition foreign to us today but natural to them. The memory of this atmosphere endures in the cores drilled from ice sheets, in the sediments pulled from lakes, in the low soils spread across continents. Together, they tell a coherent story that the Ice Age was not a static freeze, but a world of shifting winds, fluctuating gases, and constant negotiation between land, ocean, and sky. It is a reminder that climate is not fixed, that the air itself is part of the Earth's restless cycles. And as glaciers continued to melt, as seas rose and forests returned, the atmosphere shifted once again, carrying humanity into a warmer age. The record of dust and pollen faded into soils we now farm, into skies we now breathe. But deep in the ice, the memory remains. Silent bubbles of ancient air, preserving the voice of the Ice Age long after its landscapes were gone. Long before history was written, it was painted, carved, and sung into being. The people of the Ice Age did not leave us libraries of words, but they left something just as powerful: art. In caves lit by flickering fire, on ivory polished by hand, in rhythms tapped against hollow bones, they recorded their world and gave us glimpses into their minds. These creations are more than decoration. They are memory, an attempt to hold on to life, to shape meaning in the face of cold and uncertain. The most famous of these works lie hidden in caves across Europe. At Lascaux in France, walls burst with images of horses, bison, and stags, their bodies painted with ochre, charcoal, and ground minerals. The figures are not crude. They leap with motion, their muscles rippling, their forms layered in careful detail. In Chauvet, another cave sealed for millennia, lions prowl across the walls, painted with a sophistication that startles even modern eyes. The artists captured not just outlines but energy, the tension of a hunt, the power of a herd, the swirl of life itself. These paintings were not idle sketches. They were acts of focus, precision, and vision. Why they painted remains a question. Some scholars see these images as rituals, a way to call animals into being, to honor them, or to ensure success in the hunt. Others see them as stories, myths captured in image, or even as early experiments in perspective and representation. Whatever their purpose, they reveal something unmistakable. Ice Age humans were thinkers, dreamers, and storytellers. They sought not only to live in the world, but to understand it, to inscribe it into memory with color and form. Art was not confined to walls. Small carvings, known as Venus figurines, spread across Ice Age Europe and Asia. These statuettes, often of women with exaggerated forms, were carved from ivory, stone, or bone. Their meanings are debated: fertility symbols, protective charms, spiritual icons, but their presence across thousands of kilometers suggests a shared thread of belief or imagination that transcended individual groups. Holding one of these figurines in hand, one senses its weight as more than material. It is an idea made tangible, carried through generations. The tools of art were as ingenious as those of survival. Pigments came from iron oxide for reds, manganese for blacks, ground calcite for whites. Brushes were made from animal hair, reeds, or chewed sticks. Hands themselves became stencils, placed against walls and sprayed with pigment to leave ghostly outlines, a silent declaration: I was here. These prints are among the oldest self-portraits ever made, signatures without words, proof of human presence in a world that has long since vanished. Music, too, was part of this memory. Flutes carved from vulture bone or mammoth ivory, discovered in caves in Germany, date back more than 35,000 years. Their holes carefully spaced, their bodies hollowed with precision, they produced notes that echoed in dark chambers, turning caves into concert halls. The sound of these flutes may have accompanied rituals, dances, or simple gatherings by firelight. In those melodies, fleeting though they were, people gave shape to joy, sorrow, and wonder. Sound became a memory shared in the moment, carried by the air itself. The stories of the Ice Age were not limited to paint, figurines, and song. They lived in myth, the intangible but enduring fabric of culture. Though we cannot know their words directly, echoes survive in the oral traditions of later peoples. Myths of great animals, of spirits in stone, of floods and fires. may reach back into Ice Age memories. The painted lions and carved mammoths were more than art. They were symbols of power, danger, and awe, retold in campfires and etched into collective identity. Burials too carried this language of memory. Graves from the Ice Age sometimes contain beads, tools, or pigments placed with the dead. At Sungir in Russia, 2 children were buried with thousands of ivory beads, painstakingly carved and sewn into clothing. These were not mere ornaments. They were acts of remembrance, acknowledgments of value, signs that life extended beyond the moment of death. To bury with art is to believe that memory matters, that stories continue even when breath does not. Art also reflected connection with the wider world. In some caves, abstract symbols repeat: dots, zigzags, ladder-like forms, signs whose meaning we can only guess. Perhaps they were codes, a proto-weapon of sorts, or marks of groups leaving their identity on the walls. The repetition suggests communication, an attempt to record not just what was seen but what was known. In this way, Ice Age humans reached toward language beyond words, experimenting with ways to capture ideas in lasting form. The creation of art was as much about community as it was about individuals. To paint deep in a cave required light, tools, and preparation. It likely involved more than one person, perhaps entire groups, who gathered in the dark, watching figures emerge on stone as pigment touched wall. The act itself may have been performance, an event that bound people together, strengthening identity through shared vision. Just as a hunt united hunters, art united minds. What is striking about this art is its persistence. Across thousands of years and vast distances, the impulse to create remained constant. Whether in painted walls, carved figurines, decorated tools, or rhythmic music, Ice Age humans expressed themselves in ways that still resonate. These works speak not only of survival but of imagination, of minds that looked at animals and landscapes and saw more than utility. They saw meaning, beauty, and mystery. Today, when we stand before a cave painting or hold a figurine behind glass, we are connected across tens of millennia to the moment it was made. The memory of the Ice Age is not only in bones or stones, but in these creations. Fragile, deliberate, and profoundly human, they remind us that even in the coldest times, people sought warmth in ideas, leaving traces not of necessity, but of vision. Across the frozen plains, the herds once seemed endless. Mammoths moved like living mountains, their silhouettes dark against the horizon. Woolly rhinoceroses lowered their massive heads to scrape lichens from icy ground. In the Americas, armored glyptodons, beasts the size of cars, trundled across savannas, while giant ground sloths rose like towers on hind legs, stripping leaves from trees. These creatures had endured the shifting climates of 1,000,000 years. Yet as the Ice Age waned, a silence began to spread. Within a few thousand years, many of them were gone forever. The disappearance of the megafauna was not sudden in human terms, but in the scale of prehistory, it was swift. By 10,000 years ago, the Mammoth Steppe had shrunk to fragments. By 8,000 years ago, the woolly rhinoceros was extinct. In the Americas, over 70% of large animal species vanished within a span of just a few millennia. The Ice Age, once defined by abundance, ended in emptiness. What caused this collapse? Two forces converged: climate and humans. As glaciers retreated, ecosystems unraveled. The grasslands that had supported herds turned into wetlands and forests. Mammoths, perfectly adapted to dry, wind-swept plains, struggled in marshy ground. The giant sloths of South America, slow-moving and dependent on particular vegetation, found their food sources dwindling. Species adapted to cold perished as warmth advanced. This shift had happened before. Glacial cycles had always reshaped habitats, but this time another factor accelerated the change. Humans had spread across the globe. In Europe, they had lived alongside mammoths for tens of thousands of years. In Siberia, they built homes from mammoth bones, shaped tusks into tools, and painted these animals onto cave walls. In the Americas, newly arrived groups encountered creatures that had never before faced human hunters. Armed with stone-tipped spears and coordinated strategies, they targeted the great herds. Even a small increase in hunting pressure could tip populations already stressed by climate change. Archaeological evidence tells us this story in fragments. At kill sites in North America, the bones of mammoths and mastodons lie clustered with spear points among them. In Siberia, tusks carved into weapons show deliberate use of these giants not just for food but for tools and trade. At some sites, cut marks on bones show the precision of butchery, proof that humans were not merely scavengers but active hunters of giant. The extinction was not uniform. Some species lingered in isolated refuges. Mammoths survived on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean until about 4,000 years ago. At the same time, the pyramids were rising in Egypt. In Alaska, tiny populations clung on for centuries longer than their mainland cousins, but these were echoes, not survivors. Eventually, the isolation that preserved them became their downfall, as small populations collapsed from inbreeding and chance disasters. The loss of megafauna reshaped ecosystems. Without mammoths trampling snow and breaking ice, tundra landscapes changed, grasses giving way to shrubs. Without giant grazers, some plains grew overgrown, altering fire regimes and soil cycles. Predators that had relied on large prey disappeared in turn. Saber-toothed cats, cave lions, and the short-fayed bear faded alongside their quarry. The Ice Age ended not only with melting ice, but with the vanishing of its most iconic animals. The debate over extinction causes continues today. Some argue that climate alone was enough, pointing to past cycles when megafauna also declined. Others emphasize the sudden spread of humans into untouched continents. Perhaps the truth lies in the combination. Warming climates weakened populations, and human hunting delivered the final push. In Australia, the story unfolded earlier. By 45,000 years ago, the continent's marsupial giants, diprotodons, massive kangaroos, and carnivorous reptiles like megalania had disappeared. Fires set by humans to clear land may have accelerated their decline, transforming habitats faster than animals could adapt. In the Americas, the pattern repeated on a grander scale. Arrival of humans followed by rapid loss of large species, the coincidence is striking, too consistent to dismiss. The extinction of these giants was more than a loss of spectacle. It changed the balance of nature. In South America, the disappearance of glyptodons and ground sloths removed herbivores that had once spread seeds and shaped vegetation. In North America, the loss of mammoths altered grasslands, and with them, the predators and scavengers that depended on abundance. Even rivers and soils shifted, deprived of the constant disturbance of large animals. The Ice Age web unraveled thread by thread. For humans, the absence of giants brought both difficulty and opportunity. Large game had been a rich source of meat, hides, and bone. Their disappearance forced people to turn more heavily to smaller animals, plants, and eventually domestication. Some scholars argue that the pressure of extinction nudged humans toward agriculture. If herds could no longer be relied upon, they would have to be replaced by crops and livestock. In this way, the end of the megafauna was not only an ecological turning point, but a cultural one, pushing humanity toward the world we know today. The silence of extinction lingers in memory. Cave art preserves mammoths and lions long after they were gone from the land. Myths of thunderbeasts, horned monsters, and giant bears may echo recollections of creatures that vanished, but were not forgotten. Even now, when we unearth tusks from melting permafrost or skeletons from tar pits, we feel the weight of loss, not just of animals, but of an entire way of life. Extinction reminds us that survival is never guaranteed, that even the mightiest can fall when climate and humanity converge. It was not the end of life, but the end of an age, clearing the stage for new actors, new ecosystems, and new possibilities. As the last giants vanished, the world shifted once more, carrying humans into a new chapter, one where the ice itself would retreat, and the earth would become something altogether different. The Ice Age did not end in a single dramatic thaw, but in a series of uneven steps, a rhythm of warming punctuated by sudden chills. Around 20,000 years ago, the great ice sheets reached their maximum extent, covering much of North America, Northern Europe, and Siberia. From that point onward, the balance tipped. Temperatures began to rise, slowly at first, then with accelerating force. Glaciers retreated, seas advanced, and the world that had been frozen for tens of millennia gave way to something entirely new. This retreat was not gentle. The melting of ice sheets released torrents of water, carving channels and reshaping valleys. Vast proglacial lakes formed along the margins of retreating glaciers, some stretching across entire regions. Lake Agassiz in North America held more water than all the Great Lakes combined. Periodically, its icy dams collapsed, unleashing catastrophic floods that swept across continents. One such flood poured into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean circulation and plunging the world into a brief but intense return to cold. The Younger Dryas, a 1,000-year pause in the warming that marked the Earth's climate as unstable and unpredictable. When warmth returned for good, the transformation was rapid. Forests spread into land once locked in tundra. Birch and pine advanced northward, followed by oak and elm, until green canopies replaced the open Mammoth Steppe. Rivers swelled with meltwater, carrying fertile soils into valleys. Wetlands expanded, marshes teemed with life, and animals that had once been confined to southern refuges spread across the continent. The Earth was not only thawing, it was awakening into a new era. For humans, this retreat reshaped existence. The animals they had depended upon dwindled, the mammoth herds were gone, the woolly rhinoceros extinct, the great predators vanished. In their place came forests filled with deer, boar, and aurochs, powerful wild cattle that demanded new strategies to hunt. Fishing grew more important as rivers and coasts yielded salmon, eels, and shellfish. People adapted not only their tools but their way of life, shifting from roaming across frozen plains to settling in fertile valleys where resources were abundant year-round. The warming climate encouraged experimentation. Seeds sprouted in soils enriched by loess and meltwater. Wild grasses like emmer and barley grew thick in the Fertile Crescent, their grains nutritious and storable. Hunters who once followed herds began to gather these plants in larger quantities, learning to plant and harvest them deliberately. Goats and sheep, once wild quarry, were penned and bred for meat, milk, and wool. Agriculture was not invented in a single moment, but arose gradually, nurtured by the stability of a warming world. This transition marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The Ice Age had demanded mobility, resilience, and adaptation to constant change. The New Age, the Holocene, allowed permanence. Villages formed where rivers flooded predictably, their waters nourishing crops. Fields replaced roaming grounds, and storage pits replaced the chase. With agriculture came surplus, and with surplus came population growth, division of labor, and eventually the foundations of civilization. The retreat of the ice also left behind landscapes that defined the course of human settlement. U-shaped valleys carved by glaciers became fertile corridors for rivers and farms. Moraines, the rocky ridges left by retreating ice, marked the boundaries of new basins and lakes. Scandinavia rose from the sea as the weight of ice lifted, its land rebounding upward in a process still unfolding today. The fingerprints of the Ice Age were everywhere, shaping where people could live, farm, and build. Climate stability was key. For the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, Earth's temperature entered a relatively steady phase. This stability allowed agriculture to flourish, giving humans the confidence to invest in landscapes rather than chase herds across continents. In the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, in the Nile floodplain, and later along the Indus and Yellow rivers, early farming communities laid the groundwork for cities, writing, and organized states. Without the end of the Ice Age, the trajectory of human history would have been utterly different. But this transformation was not uniform. While some regions grew fertile, others dried. The Sahara, once a land of lakes and grasslands teeming with hippos and fish, began to shift into desert as monsoon rains retreated. People who had lived by those waters migrated toward the Nile, concentrating populations and accelerating the rise of complex societies. Climate change pressed humanity into new shapes, just as it had shaped animals and plants during the long millennia of ice. Even as humans built villages and fields, memories of the Ice Age lingered. Myths of floods, ice, and fire carried echoes of real events: rising seas that drowned coasts, glaciers that carved valleys, storms unleashed by melting ice. The last retreat was not only geological, but cultural. It became part of humanity's collective memory, transformed into stories that warned of fragility, change, and renewal. The Ice Age ended, but its legacy endured. The landscapes we farm, the rivers we follow, the soils we depend on, all were gifts of retreating glaciers. The resilience honed by survival in the cold prepared humanity for the challenges of a warmer world, and as forests spread and fields grew, the stage was set for civilizations to rise. Yet the memory of ice remained, a quiet reminder that Earth's climate has never been fixed, and that every warm age carries within it the possibility of change. Look out across the modern world and you can still see the handwriting of the Ice Age. Mountains shaped like crescents, valleys carved into U-shapes, lakes scattered like fragments of broken glass across the north, all of them were sculpted by ice. When glaciers advanced, they ground stone into powder, pushing boulders for miles, gouging deep scars into bedrock. When they retreated, they left behind ridges, plains, and fertile soils. To walk through Scandinavia, the Great Lakes region, or the Alps, is to walk through the architecture of vanished glaciers. Some of the richest farmland on Earth owes its fertility to Ice Age dust. Low soils, blown across Europe and Asia during the coldest phases, settled into deep blankets that today feed millions through agriculture. The black earth of Ukraine, the fertile fields of northern China, the Midwest of the United States, all are gifts of an era long gone. Without the Ice Age, human settlement patterns would look entirely different. Rivers, too, trace their origins to retreating ice. The Thames, the Rhine, the Mississippi, even the Nile. All were shaped, redirected, or nourished by glacial melt. Great proglacial lakes burst their icy dams and carved canyons that still amaze us. The channeled scablands of Washington state, for instance, are scars of floods unleashed when ice sheets collapsed. The very waterways that nurtured civilizations were born from the violence of melting glaciers. But the legacy of the Ice Age runs deeper than landscapes. It lives in our stories. Across cultures, myths of floods, frozen wastes, and world-shaping giants echo experiences rooted in Ice Age memory. In Norse tradition, the world begins in Ginnungagap, a yawning void between fire and ice. In Greek myth, floods erase earlier ages of man. Indigenous traditions from the Americas tell of giant animals, thunderbirds, and spirits bound to ice and storm. These tales may not describe the Ice Age literally, but they carry its imprint. The awe, the fear, the sense of living on the edge of forces larger than life. Even our bodies bear its signature. Genetic studies reveal adaptations that trace back to glacial times. Populations that lived in colder climates developed stockier builds, conserving heat. Variations in skin pigmentation reflect the balance between sunlight needed for vitamin D and protection against ultraviolet rays. An evolutionary dance shaped in part by the Ice Age sun filtering through clouds and snow. In some regions, the ability to digest milk as adults, lactose tolerance, emerged as a survival advantage when herds were domesticated after the ice retreated, linking human biology directly to the end of glaciation. The Ice Age also forged paths of migration that left lasting genetic fingerprints. The movement across Beringia into the Americas is still visible in the DNA of indigenous peoples, a living record of that frozen bridge. Similarly, genetic patterns in Europe and Asia show traces of survival in glacial refuges, pockets where humans endured, isolated for thousands of years, before expanding again when warmth returned. Every one of us carries a fragment of that deep history in our cells. Science continues to uncover these legacies with increasing clarity. Ice cores pulled from Greenland and Antarctica preserve tiny bubbles of air that reveal not only past climates, but the timing of changes that shaped human evolution. Ancient DNA extracted from permafrost or fossil bones tells us about populations of mammoths, cave bears, and humans, showing how they rose, mingled, and fell. The Ice Age is not silent. It speaks through ice, stone, and genes if we know how to listen. The cultural legacy of the Ice Age is equally profound. The first art, music, and symbolic thought, born in caves and carved into ivory, did not vanish with warming climates. They seeded the development of mythology, religion, and the very concept of history. When humans later built temples, cities, and civilizations, they drew from mental tools sharpened in the Ice Age: memory, imagination, ritual. The same impulse that painted mammoths on stone walls guided the stories of gods, kings, and empires. The landscapes left by ice became the stage for this unfolding drama. The fertile valleys of the Tigris, the Nile, and the Yellow River were enriched by glacial deposits and meltwater. The forests of Europe, once tundra, nurtured communities that gave rise to cultures stretching into the medieval and modern worlds. Even the deserts, left by shifting monsoons and vanished lakes, shaped human migration, forcing innovation and resilience. The Ice Age also offers lessons for the present. It reminds us that climate is not static, that shifts in temperature and atmosphere can transform ecosystems and societies. The difference between an Earth wrapped in ice and the one we inhabit today was only a matter of a few degrees. That knowledge humbles us. It tells us that the balance we rely on is fragile, and that change can come with both devastation and opportunity. Modern science carries the memory further. Geologists read the striations of rock, biologists trace lineages in DNA, climatologists model the rhythms of ancient air. Each discipline contributes to a mosaic of understanding, piecing together a time when the world was both alien and familiar. The Ice Age may have ended, but its record continues to shape how we think about Earth's past and its future. And then there is the quiet legacy, the emotional imprint. To imagine herds of mammoths sweeping across frozen plains, to see the handprints of ancestors on cave walls, to hear the echo of flutes carved from bone. These are not just facts, but connections. They remind us that the people of the Ice Age were not others, but us, separated by time yet bound by the same drive to endure, to create, to remember. The Ice Age gave us landscapes, myths, and genes, but it also gave us perspective. It shows that humanity is part of a vast cycle of adaptation, survival, and change. The last retreat of the glaciers opened the way for agriculture and civilization, but the lessons of ice remain etched into the ground we walk and the stories we tell. The earth we know is shaped by what came before, and deep beneath the soil and in the air we breathe, the memory of ice still lingers.